All right, because I got people waiting. All right, let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs, bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs, bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs, bestowing life. Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen.
So actually, this is our last Sunday that we'll be doing the Gospel beginning and the Christ is risen, because next week is Ascension, and you go, so all that ends on Ascension, and then you're in this weird, not quite Pentecost, but not quite Pascha period for 10 days, where you kind of have a little, it's slightly different. So you're going to start to notice some of the liturgical changes that we, if you remember Holy Week, our Bright Week, it was all very, very, and then after that you kind of bring it down a little bit, and now we bring it down a little bit more, and then when we get to Pentecost, we restart the whole church cycle again. So anyway, just as a note, and so just notice that. And wasn't it wonderful having the icon here? It was amazing. Yeah. And
it smelled so strong.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
crazy.
So I'm so glad it worked out, and then I was so shocked when we got the relic of St. Gregory the theologian. So I just put it in its little case. It's going to go in that icon of St. Gregory back there where you walk in. So that's a very, very difficult relic to get. I mean, that's over 1,000 years old.
Really?
And St. Gregory the theologian in the 9th century. So, yeah. Where did he get it from?
No, I was shocked that we had a relic from St. Helena.
Yeah, that was in the icon. Yeah.
There's a lot going on in that icon.
Yeah, there is.
There really
the
is.
legs and the
So
hands.
much.
Okay, does anybody know what that was about?
That's
What, the
Greek
hand?
one, right?
Yeah, all the little things that were in the icon. It's a very, sometimes you'll see that in certain icons.
I'm guessing it's all the people that had a miracle.
Yeah, or they were praying for the healing of their hand or their leg, and so they buy these little things and they put it on the icon as part of a prayer. It is what it is, shall we say. It's not a recommended sort of thing, but people do it out of piety. And then all those rings, he said there are boxes and boxes of offerings. So those are things that people offered, like they were healed, or they had something they gave a ring, or you go to somebody, they have watches. I mean, whatever they have, and so you kind of it's a pious sort of thing that you do. I don't encourage it. I wouldn't encourage that here, but it is what it is, and so that's what all that stuff around the icon was. And
So she's always at the monastery.
Yeah, so if you go into the monastery church, they have, it's like a cross. So you'll see there's two wings, and she's always resting on the left side on one of the wings. Yeah.
And why is the icon referred to as she?
Because it's a she. It's her.
Saint Anna.
So that's what I was wondering, what is the context of that saying?
Well, it's Saint Anna. So
Literally?
No, but you say
she.
It's a she.
We're referring
to that. She is that icon.
Okay.
Right.
Or just for me, it would be.
Yeah,
Right.
instead of saying the icon.
So is it okay to assume the gender though?
Yes. We were not assuming, we're telling you what it is. God created. No, I'm not going to get there. Do not go me down that rabbit hole. But it was a wonderful experience, and that hierodeacon, it's so good to see him. So he used to work for me back when I first came to the Chancery. He was driving the Metropolitan around and kind of his caretaker, and he did jobs for me. And then I knew his dad very well. We both came about the same time to the Diocese of the West, and I remember when he decided to go to the monastery and broke someone's heart, but he's done very well, and I just crack up because he's got the long beard, and the point when I knew him, he didn't have any beard, it's short hair, so every time I see him, I'm like, oh my God, it's getting longer, but that's a monk, you're supposed to do.
He looks so young behind that.
So
They're
it
not
was
supposed to shave at all?
Well, they don't have mirrors.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in the monastery you don't have mirrors. That's why they wear their. You're not supposed to look in a mirror.
And is that why schema monks always have their things, their cows covering their faces?
No, well, it's supposed to be humility, but somewhere weird. But yeah, so they don't have. That's why usually they don't have the hair just flowing. They'll tie it up in like a bun. But if you're a priest or something, you'll let it out during the service.
What?
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah. So that's a monastic thing. We have too many married priests who want to pretend they're monastics and grow long hair and long beard, and I don't, because I'm not a monastic by any means.
I'm telling
Thank
Father
God.
Alexander you said that.
What?
I said, I'm telling Father Alexander you said that.
What? Oh, I teased them about it all the time.
Yeah, I know.
One of the first things I tell them in class: cut your hair, just trim your beard. You're not hippies anymore.
Right.
Wear proper shoes. I will check to see if you shine your shoes, because there are parishioners who will look to see if you shine your shoes. Make sure your fingernails are clean. People have to kiss your hand. Who wants to kiss a priest with dirty fingernails? You know, so that's priest etiquette 101.
That's
So
a bad priest.
take mouthwash before you do confessions. You know, these are things. So our new seminarian is Jared Reese, very nice young man. You'll get to meet him. He'll be ordained this summer to deacon. His wife is from Paramus, so he's from Cleveland, and he's very excited to be here. And so I just did all the assignments yesterday. They all got their emails. So this was a tough one this year because I had 3 non-normal OCA students that I had to deal with. And their bishops were being pain in the necks, and they weren't answering me.
Non-normal?
Well, one Romanian in the Romanian Archdiocese, and then one in the Albanian Archdiocese, and they have one in the Carpatho. And then I had one who's Georgian, but he's in the OCA Diocese South, and I wanted to send him to the Georgian mission in Brooklyn, but he doesn't want to go there, which reminds me I didn't email that priest. I have to email.
So each diocese is its own bishop role.
Yeah. Yeah, diocese is head by a bishop.
You missed the class.
You missed that class. Go back. So today, we're going to talk about the last of the 4 ships. If you remember, we talked about discipleship, apostleship, fellowship, and today we're going to talk about that most exciting of topics, stewardship. And as I previewed, it's not what you think it is. So we're going to talk about that. Next week, we're going to do salvation. I know a lot of people have been wanting that class, and we'll talk a bit about theosis. And then I decided to add one final class before the summer, and that's going to be how to be a parishioner.
I like it. So 2 more.
2 more. And then we'll take a summer break. I talked to the council. I gave them the preview of my plan for next September. We're going to continue Orthodoxy 101, though it's one day of 1 week, the first Thursday of each week, I won't be able to have the class because I'm now the chaplain for the fire department.
The first Thursday each week?
Each month.
Oh.
Because I'm now the chaplain for the fire department, and I have the meeting there. And so it'll be, but also we're going to have a new set of things called in-depth orthodoxy. In-depth orthodoxy. And we're going to talk more about this. And what it's going to be is led by you. It's going to be led by anybody who has a subject. Bring it to the group and say, you know what? I'm interested in this subject. I'm going to do the research, or a couple of you, and I'm going to present a series of classes on this. Whether it's a Bible study, or it's a particular theological concept, or history, or whatever you want.
I like it. That's going to be cool.
And then you can, and I'll be there to help guide the discussion to make sure no heresies are being proclaimed. But whatever you want, and we'll have a chance to do a deep dive on one subject for however long, and then we'll go to another subject, and we'll go to another subject. The only thing I haven't figured out is what I'm going to do it. So I have a couple of ideas on when to do it. Maybe Sunday afternoon. It may be a Saturday afternoon. It may be one of the weeks. I only have so many weeknights, and people have so many. So we're going to talk about it as a parish and come up with it, which going to work best for everyone. So if you have a particular topic you're thinking about, start thinking about it. And we'll probably in a couple of weeks I'll start talking about, because people may want to read certain things over the summer and get ready for that. Yeah, so that's the newest. That's part 2 of what you learned here. And whether I'm going to podcast it, I don't know yet. I haven't decided. I may not.
Podcast?
Yeah, put it on live stream.
Stream it?
Yeah. So I haven't decided that either. So anyway, what's that?
No, it's scary when that's not on. That's what be fun. So, not fun, you know.
What's in that Dunkin' Donuts there? So, a good book. The council we've been discussing this book, and George has been discussing this book. It's called Money and Salvation. I have another book, The First and the Finest. I gave it to Virginia or Serge. I can't remember. You have it. Okay. So here, this is what I'm going to do, George. This is your book. I'm done. So you can have it back. So now I'm officially off the hook on that. So anyway. Stewardship is a very misunderstood concept. Because immediately when we talk about stewardship, everyone's going to immediately think about money. And money is only just a small part of it. And for us to understand it, we have to kind of go back and kind of unpack what that word means and kind of take a look biblically. However, the single most talked about topic in the New Testament is about money. Christ, 11 of the 39 parables, that Christ talks about, deal with money. 2,300 passages in the Bible, the Old and New Testament alone, is about wealth. 25% of the Bible talks about money. So do you think it's an important subject? The question we should ask ourselves, why? Is because God is worried about your wealth? Or is there something deeper going on in there? Matthew 6:21. You read my bi-monthly newsletters? Every time, break my heart. Every time, on the one column on the second page is all the finances of the parish for the past 2 months and the parish council blurb and all that. I have a quote from Matthew 6:21. Where your heart is, so also will be your treasure. So that immediately tells me that there's something more going on. That money is just a means to understanding our spiritual life. And it's one of many, but it's an important one. And I think we can all acknowledge that, because how many times, let's put it this way, some of the best givers in my parishes that I've been in were the people with the least amount of money. And the ones who gave me more agita and heartache were usually the wealthy people in the parish. Because I had one guy who actually quit my parish because the council decided after 7 years in the parish, they were going to give me a 2% raise. And he walked out. So, well, he was an interesting person. He was a Serb. Anyway, so very often, where our heart is so important about how, you don't invest in something you don't believe in, right? You don't put money into something you don't have faith in, right? You like PBS, so what do you do when they have their interminable drive, fundraising drive? You give money because you like PBS, right? That's part of it, because that's where your heart is. You have different causes in your life that you are passionate about, and you donate money towards that. It's not about the donating of the money. It's about where your heart is. See what I'm saying? You with me? And by the way, how many times in the Gospels do we talk about the widow who has nothing and gives that little bit amount, and Christ praises her? Because it was done out of a sense of love and fidelity and trust, not out of a sense of, well, let's make sure we only talk to the rich people in the parish and make sure we can pay our bills. So anyway, so ultimately, stewardship is a spiritual issue. I'm sorry, I don't preach prosperity gospel. I don't have my private airplane. I don't have my big mansion, you know. It's a spiritual issue, and the conversation always has to begin on how it affects our spiritual life. So let's start with that. So, anybody know what the Greek word for stewardship is? Special gold star today for anybody who gets it, except George, because George knows.
You can't say
Come on, you read the book. It's economos. Economos. You ever heard the word economy? Right? Economy comes from that word, economos. And who was the economos? He was the chief steward of a household. So in other words, it was someone who was invested with a lot of power. The economos was someone who ran the household. You know, so you had the master of the house, and he put in a position of great trust who would run the household, pay the bills, take care of all the operation. He was the steward of the operation, right? So the economos was someone who was like your right-hand man. And you had to be someone you trusted because he had the keys, he had the control, he made sure all the work got done, all that sort of thing. So, and he decided ultimately how to use the money in the household. Because, you know, the master, I don't get involved in that stuff. Rich people, it's a different world, right?
So
But
your wife is the economist.
Oh, yeah, most wives are the economists, yeah. And we just write the checks. We don't even write checks anymore. Anyway. So, the important thing about this term of this person, the economos, is it wasn't necessarily about the money. He had control of the money. But he was the one who made sure it was used properly and efficiently and effectively. Right? So that means that he had to understand what the resources were available, how to use and direct those resources, and who was best positioned to utilize the other people's talents and gifts. So if he knew Hank was a good painter, which he is, right, he would say, okay, Hank, you're the person that's going to paint the house because we know you can do it. Right? Or if you had another person who had the gift for a cook or whatever it may be, the economos was the person in charge of that. So in the ideal sense, he was always striving to use all the gifts, all the talents, all the resources to the best effect. Now, of course, we know not all economoses were honest, right? Some were dishonest people, some kept it. I mean, that's where Christ talks a lot in the New Testament, where you know, the foolish steward, the couple of the parables where he talks about the person who didn't use it wisely. Think about the parable of the 10 talents, right? He gave one person 1 talent, and one person 5, and one person 10. And they invested it and used it wisely and got back. But the one who had, he didn't do anything. He buried it, he hid it, and Christ yelled at him. Because he didn't use what he was given to glorify and to bring increase. All right, so you understand where that term comes? Which, by the way, if we think in political terms, when we talk about the economy, how often do our politicians and people think about that in terms of being stewards? Of being stewards and making sure everything's being used wisely and efficiently. Not overdoing on taxes and all the other stuff. But we'll not go there. So, the best and easiest way that I've always had it explained to me, and I always understand it, is the 3 T's. To be a good economos means that you have to be able to use the 3 T's. Time, talent, and treasure. So how do we effectively use our time? How do we effectively use our talent? And how effectively do we use our treasure? And when we talk about stewardship, all 3 of those things should always be together. Today, some of the ladies were out there working on the garden. Darlene was one of them. And that was a beautiful gift of time and talent. And some treasure, too, because you had to buy stuff. And you use that in order to make something that's going to be beautiful for the church and for God. Right? So that was an act of stewardship that you did down there, whether you realized it or not. So what's the best use of our time? And how are we giving of our time to God, first and foremost, and to others? What's the best use of our talents? How are we using that for the building up of the church and for serving others? And treasure. Are we using all the gifts that God has bestowed upon us for the glory of God and others? What's the 2 concepts that I keep bringing up in all 3 of those? God and others. Right? And by doing that, you're glorifying God. By serving others, you're glorifying God. You're being a Christian. And so all that we have is all to be used for the glory of God. Because we are stewards. Everything we have, we are been given to be stewards of. Right from the very beginning, from Genesis, what happens when God gives him dominion over the earth, right? And all the creatures. He gives man. And he says, be good stewards. Be good stewards of what you've been given. And sometimes we're not. But yet God commands us that if he's going to give us this, he's going to expect us to do it in the glory of God and do it in a good and honorable way. So when we think of terms of being a steward, God gives each of us gifts. He gives each of us time. He gives each of us talent. He gives each of us treasure. And in some cases, in different measures. Sometimes little, sometimes great. Whatever it is. And we are asked to be using it properly, responsibly, and appropriately. And this is the reason why Christ talks about this so much. It's not about the money, right? Because very often in those parables and those things, it's usually about someone misusing it. And because they're misusing it, they're not glorifying God, who is entrusted it to that person. And if you notice, the other thing is, with many of these parables and these things, they always start with, the kingdom of heaven is like. And then they go, boop, 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 boop. And whenever you hear the kingdom of heaven is like, our radar should go way up. This is important. This is about salvation. This is Christ telling us how we should behave, how we should be stewards, how we should act towards one another. Just flip through the Bible, and you'll find one of those parables, usually in Matthew, and you can see how many times that comes up over and over and over. So, the first acknowledgement we have to make is that everything we have comes from God. Our time, our talent, our treasure, all comes from God. The people who make their fortunes, they use the time and the talent that God gave them to build that up. But that money is still for God. They just forget about it. So very often we forget that everything we own, everything comes from God. And it is our job to offer it back to him. During the liturgy, you notice there's one part when we start the anaphora, when we start the consecration of the gifts. And I hold up, I have my back to you, but I hold the chalice and the paten. And what do I say? Anybody? I lift it way high. Thine own, I offer unto thee on behalf of all and for all. Unpack that statement. What does that say? thine own. God, thine is God. Of thine own. No, it's yours, and it belongs to you. But we're offering it up to you on behalf of all and for all. The liturgy is the ultimate act of stewardship, the ultimate act of economos. We're offering all those things that God has given us back to him in the glory of God. And so when we say that phrase, it's packed with so much meaning that we forget the message that's being said there. And if we think of that in our whole life, in whatever we do, in our time, our talent, our treasure, and we think of it in the terms of thine own, this is yours, you've given it to me, I'm giving it back to you, on behalf of all and for all. That's the ultimate liturgical act. You find that throughout the Old Testament. Even think about someone like, Abraham offering up his son, his firstborn son, offering him up to be sacrificed. Tell me that didn't damage that kid for life. No. But
They were tougher back then.
they were tougher back then. He's willing to offer up the son that he had been praying for and waiting for and agonizing, yet he's willing to offer that up to God as a burnt offering. Doesn't even hesitate. So then we're asked to do something a little bit less. But think about this. God never does anything, never asks of anything that he's not willing to do himself. So who offers up his firstborn? His son. Right? Christ. And he does get sacrificed. Of course, we know at the end of the story, right? He also rises from the dead, and etc. That act of Abraham is seen as kind of the prefigurement of the act of Christ. But God himself is willing to offer his firstborn. The only born. The only incarnate. On behalf of us and for us. Makes you think a little bit differently about everything that you have. St. Paul in 1 Peter 4:10 exhorts us to be good stewards of God's grace. So even the gifts that he gives, the grace that he gives to us, the grace that we have being Orthodox and being baptized and receiving the body and blood of Christ and the sacraments and all the other things, we're also supposed to be good stewards of that. Right? Just think about the pre-communion prayers and go through them one day and really read what they're saying. Neither like Judas will I give thee a kiss. In other words, I'm going to be a good and faithful to what I see. All the other lines, it's all about being a good steward of the gift, what God has given us. Ultimately, his body and blood in the Eucharist. St. Polycarp of Smyrna, one of the first saints of the church. St. Polycarp was the he was the disciple of St. John the theologian. And by the way, if you ever really want to read something fascinating, everyone thinks, the Apostle Paul, he wrote to all those different cities, to Galatians and to the Colossians and the Thessalonians. Well, a few years later, Polycarp is writing to those same places. We have his letters. And they're fascinating because they still have the problems that Apostle Paul had and was saying. But he's writing it to those people as a successor. All this continues, right? Anyway, so this is what he writes. He says, this is to one of the particular cities of the Apostle Paul. Be stewards in God's house, members of his household, and his servants. Now think about how he worded that. Be stewards in God's house. What's he talking about? The church. The church in wherever that happens to be. Be members of his household, because it's his church, not our church. It's his church. And be his servants, not my servants. So, if we understand this, then we have to be stewards of all God creation. We must care for the church, for each other, those God's places in our life. In fact, all of God's creation. We are stewards on this earth, and we must use it responsibly for the glory of God. We do not own it. We simply care for it on his behalf. We care for our children. We care for our house. We care for our car. We care for this church. We care for our neighbor. We care for the dog walking down the street. It's all God's. And we're just there to be stewards. So, how many times do we do that perfectly? How many times do we do that completely? Pretty rarely, right? Which is why then we see the spiritual issue. Why Christ has to talk about this. Because we all fall short. We know that. We all fall short. So when we care for something, right? If we really love something, we don't do it for our own selfish needs, but for others. You love your child. You care for your child. You don't do it out of any sense of egotism. You do it because you love and care for that child. Hence, you're a steward of that child. As much as they drive you crazy. And they do. And they will. So, we are constantly being told to do this. You're very bad at bringing me this. So let's talk about the next part. Matthew 5:15, where he talks about we should not hide our light under the basket where darkness pervades. But as he continues in verse 16, let your light so shine before men so they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Most of us hide our light under the bushel, under the basket. Right? We don't shine like we should be shining. But he commands us to let your light so shine before men so they may see their good works and rejoice. Which, by the way, next time the bishop comes and we have a hierarchical liturgy, and after he's so fully vested in all his vestments, and he has the two sets of candles, the deacon says exactly those words. So let your light shine before men so they may see your good works and glorify God. The bishop is the oikonomos of the diocese. In fact, in Greek, that's actually a term that is given to bishops. The oikonomos.
What about episcopus?
Episcopus is overseer.
Is he also the episcopus?
Yeah. Yes.
What about the term that is supposed to turn a presbyter?
Presbyter means elder. Elder. But you see, this is one of those problems in English. We translate presbyter as elder, but if you properly translate it, it's priest. So when you all gather the elders together, it means gather the priests together. The priests are the extension of the bishop. They're the senior people, the elders. We heard about that a couple of weeks ago in the service when it talks about electing the new people and the apostles and laying hands on them. So the presbyter, I'm a presbyter.
And your wife was a presbyterian.
In Greek, they call the wife presbytera.
So,
Just like in Russian, it's priest and the wife is matushka. And there's all different, everyone has different terms. Huri in Arabic, Papadi in Serbian. Anyway.
So, in modern day Greece, if you go there, when they refer to a priest, are they going to say
Presbyter, yeah. Yeah.
So, like, when you refer to, it's like an Orthodox priest. And,
You could call him presbyter.
right, what do they normally say, like, in conversation? Would they say, hey, go to the presbyter?
No, they'd say father.
They would say father.
Right, but presbyter is a title. Father is just the sort of endearing term.
Right.
But presbyter,
Presbyter Eric?
yeah,
Like Father Eric?
yeah. Archpresbyter, because I'm an archpriest. First priest. So, but yeah, it's just like bishop, his technical title is, the archbishop. But you call him Vladika, which means dad, or bishop, whatever, but
Vladika means dad.
dad.
Wow.
Kind of like yeah. So, all those terms have a root and have an understanding of what it is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Good question. Okay. So, we've pumped up, and I'm just looking at my notes. So let's turn to the more practical aspects, because you want to learn about stewardship, so let's talk about the practical. Does everyone understand the theological concepts? I just reduced that entire book to 10 minutes. Anyway, actually, I wrote this before that book ever came out. I would always say one of the most common questions I get, and I especially get this when I have to do sacraments like baptisms and funerals. Well, how much should we give the church? Any idea what my answer is?
You can.
What?
What you can.
Whatever, you pray on it and give what you think is right. Well, come on, Father. You got to give me a better answer than that. It's the answer you're getting. I'm not going to tell you, baptism costs $200 and funerals cost, which some do. And actually, I'm forbidden to do that by canon law. But I'm not supposed to charge for sacraments. But you always tell me, what should I give to the church when people become new members? That is between you and God. And you have to pray and do. I will give you standards. I'll talk about it later. But I can't tell you what to give. Yeah?
Where's the 10%?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
That is coming. But it's at the end of the conversation. I love to talk. All right, so my answer is search your heart, pray, and give what you think. But give. Give of your time, give of your talent, and give of your treasure. That's the key. And they should all three be together. So, we talked about that. First and foremost, your giving should be first fruits. What do I mean by that? If you go back into the Old Testament, and each and every time when they were told, and they literally did this. Actually, I'm preparing a talk for the Malankara, the Indian Orthodox Church Leadership Council I'm giving. And they're using this interesting quote from Nehemiah. And it's interesting as I was going through the book of Nehemiah, and how it came out, that they took 10% of everything they got right away, off the top, before they did anything else, and they gave it. So say your farm had, you had an abundant harvest. Before you even thought of anything else, 10% of it went to God. And by the way, do you know what they did to this? George knows. What did they do with it in the temple?
Oh, the burning? Yeah.
They burned it.
They burned it.
They burned it. Now think about that. You're barely making a living. You're eking it out. And you have a couple of cows and they give birth to a calf. And you give that calf to the temple, the first 10%. And what do they do with it? They slaughter it and burn it to God. Yeah.
Why don't we do that anymore? Is there a reason?
Yeah, because Christ was the ultimate sacrifice. We don't do the burnt offering because Christ fulfilled it in his own death. So now we do the bloodless sacrifice.
What's that?
The Eucharist. That's why we don't do that. Why, you want me to slaughter cattle on the altar? I have a funny joke, but I'm not going to tell it. What? A joke about that. But I'm not going to tell it. It's a joke you say among priests, so we say. Actually, by the way, just as an aside, say if I was in the altar and I cut my finger, I have to leave the altar. Right? And I have to make sure it stops bleeding and it's covered before I can go back into the altar.
So there's no sharp edges in there.
Oh, there's plenty. I use knives. I cut the bread. I do all that sort of stuff.
You just said a little close up there.
Yeah, that's another story.
Kill anything up there.
Can't kill anything. Can't kill the bugs. Gotta shoot them out.
What if they have the body and blood on them?
I eat it.
Yeah, right.
I have.
The air?
I have.
Yeah.
They fall into the. That's why I put a cover on it. Because they've fallen in, and I've had to.
So what if
Let's not go there.
Okay. Yeah. You ever see Karate Kid with yeah, you catching Jackie Chan?
Anyway, so we give everything. We don't give the leftovers. We don't do our, we don't say, okay, this is my budget. This is how much money I have for the month. All right, I'm going to pay all my bills. And whatever's left over, I'll give to the church. It's reverse. You give to the church first, to God first. And then everything else follows. And that's the way in which the Israelites thought. If everything we own belongs to God, then everything, the very first things that we do should be given to God. And that's just money. Let's think about our time. How much time do we spend with doing stuff in the church? Well, I come to church on Sunday, right? That's my tithe. And like we talked about, Sunday is the first day of the week, not the last day of the week. It's the first day, so we start our week off giving it to God. But do you think we spend 10% of our week serving the church? Serving one another? Not even close. I do, because it's my job. But, so think about, and then we start thinking about our talents. Have we given 10% right off the top of the gifts that God gives us, whether it's cooking or whatever it may be, and give it to God right off the top? And just to remind you, remember, you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. Love God your Father. Right? Christ is the greatest commandment. The second one is like that. Love your neighbor as yourself. So when you're loving and doing those things for your neighbor, you're also doing it for God. So we often think of just giving our leftovers, not our first fruits. Think about the Feast of Transfiguration, right? It's coming up in August. And what do we do on the Feast of Transfiguration? Anybody remember? What do I bless? It's the greatest feast in the world. It's my birthday. No. What do I have in the middle of the church and I bless?
Fruit.
Who said that? There you go, George. Fruit. Right? We bless fruit. Well, why would we bless fruit on Transfiguration? It has nothing to do with the feast. Christ on the mountain, shining with the light, and Moses and Elijah. Where's the icon? Right over there. Has nothing to do with fruit. So why do we bless fruit? Take a guess? That's right. That's the time of the year when, let's look at the supermarket, when all the fruits are coming in, right? I mean, I know now because we ship it from all over, but it was very seasonal, right? So all the fruit would start to be ripe. And we would take that first fruit. We kind of lost it in modern society. All the newly ripened and harvested fruit, the grapes, which is traditionally what it was, and we bring it to church, and we bless it and offer it back to God.
And then would we eat it?
Yeah.
No, they burn.
Yeah, no, you eat it. So right there from the beginning. Same with Transfiguration, or Dormition, which is just a few days later, August 15th. We bless flowers and herbs. And that's when it's all becoming ripe in your garden, right? Right about that time. So you bring it in and you bless it and you offer to God. Honey. August 1st is when we bless honey. Same thing. That's when the honey is now, the new honey's coming out.
That's when I went to the Orthodox Church for the first time. I went to a roll call and they were blessing honey.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so crazy.
Yep. So you could see how it all works together. So, first rule, first fruits. Start thinking about that. Second rule, not rule. We're against rules, right? Too many rules. First guideline, guidance. Regularly. You give regularly. It becomes a discipline. Just like we are asked to pray regularly, come to confession regularly, to commune regularly, you give regularly. Whatever that is, you make that and you stick with it. You decide, and then you discipline yourself. to make sure that you're doing that. We have people who give, for example, in this church, weekly, monthly, annually. Someone gives big check, annual check, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, you do. Third thing, give freely. Right? Matthew 10:5-8. Freely you have received, freely you give. It has to be a free will offering. I should not, Father Eric, come and say, well, to be a member of this parish, each of you have to pay $50 a year. Your membership dues, or whatever. Right.
And I don't get much money that way.
Well.
$50 a year.
When the OCA was on the dues system, there was literally a huge fight at an All-American Council that I was chairing about raising the annual giving from each parishioner in the OCA from like $75 to $80. Literally, this took 2 hours of my life that I will never get back as people argued about a $5 a year. A year.
Is that still a thing?
So-
No. It took many years, but we got rid of it. So think about that. Where was our heart in all of this? So you have to give freely, right? It's got to be your choice. I can't coerce you. No one can coerce you. It has to be joyful. Because like that meeting, well, where was your spiritual life in that one when you're sitting there arguing about $5 a year increase? And I couldn't say anything because, that part of that paid my salary. And I had to keep my mouth shut. People kept kicking me in, like I wanted to stand up and say something. People are kicking me, don't say a word, don't say a word. Okay, I'll keep my mouth shut. But it has to be joyful. If you're not giving with joy, and you're giving grudgingly, then it's not a gift to God. And how many times do we do that? Heck, every April 15th, we have to write that check to the IRS, right? Give that money to the government, right? Not that I'm, whatever. The point is, where does that make you feel like? Angry, anxious, sad, whatever you want to call it. When Mary was presented in the temple as a little child, and she was brought to the steps, do you know what she did? She danced joyfully up the steps to offer her life to God. And then she lived in the temple until such time as she was betrothed to Joseph. The parents were willing to take their child, St. Anna, who was just with us, right, and give it to God. And they did so joyfully. And how often do we do that? I know. I come up here and say, we're having another, special collection. I can see some of the faces. I can see everything from up there,
We had a special collection one time, and George was with the basket, and it was like, I said, well, I only have 100. Well, there it went.
There it went.
Felt good about it.
I bet you it came back to you. It always does.
Sure, I feel good.
Every time you do that, it comes back. Not that we're a prosperity gospel, anyway. But Apostle Paul states in 2 Corinthians 9, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, right? Whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he decides in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. For God loves a cheerful giver. You can't get any more clear than that, right? God loves a cheerful giver. So be thankful and full of joy that God has blessed you to be able to give. How often do we think of that? That God has blessed us so that we can give.
There was something that was said in the conference that we went to that I thought was rather enlightening. That God gives to us continuously, even though we squander it, and still gives to us. And I liken it to something, I don't remember exactly what you had said, or someone had said, that every time that happens, that's an opportunity for us to give back to God, to grow closer
That's right.
to God. And most of the time we just squander it and in many ways think it belongs to us.
And it doesn't.
And it doesn't.
Next one. Next point. Sacrificially. You have to give sacrificially. You have to feel it. It's like that first fruits. If you don't feel that you're giving, like you're just skimming it off the top and it makes no difference in your life, then you'll never realize that you're actually giving. You have to give with a certain sense of sacrifice. The Apostle Paul again writes, 2 Corinthians 8. Actually, read the whole section. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given to the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded for us for the privilege, look how Paul puts that, the privilege of sharing in the service of the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then by the will of God also to us. Do we think that way? Thank you for the privilege of me being able to help, me able to give. I want to tell you one story. And it was one of those ones that it really brought this home to me. So I was at one of the meetings, kind of like a dinner meeting at St. Vladimir Seminary. And all the trustees were there and all the kind of benefactors, and all the professors are there to talk to them and explain what you're doing and, whatever. It's a big fundraising event. And very wealthy man, let's just put it this way, he owned a very major newspaper in the Midwest. Was so moved that he gave half of his wealth to the seminary. And he was so moved by what this was, he said, I've given and given and given, but I never felt it. And I wanted to feel this. I wanted to make it noticeable in my bank account and all the things. That was pretty powerful. It was a major gift to the church. And he was a very generous person. He was Orthodox, very generous. He gave to churches, local churches, gave to OCA, gave of his time, gave of his talent. He was always involved with things. I knew him quite well. He was just one of those people who was just like, he was always doing something for the church. But as he said, I never actually felt the sacrifice. And he did. Of course, if you're a multimillionaire and you give $1 million, you still have $1 million, right? Yeah. But that's not the point, right? That's not the point. So, I knew someone was going to pick up on that, but don't go there. The next one, give without expectation. This is a very important one. Something as a priest you hear all the time. Father, I'm willing to give you this money if you do X, Y, Z. Father, I'm willing to give you this money, but this is what I want it used for. In some cases, it may not even be a bad thing that they want it to be used for. But then they're putting conditions on it. And then it's not a free will offering, is it? It's a gift with strings attached. Luke 6:35. But love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Think about that. How many times have you done that? I always tell that story of my grandmother, right? On her deathbed, my Sicilian Italian grandmother, on her deathbed, she was angry about $50 she gave to her brother-in-law something like 50 years ago, and he never repaid it. Here he's about to meet God, right? About to die, and she was talking to me about how she was still angry at him. That's no way to die. That's no way to die. And so when you give with no expectations. You just give. And you have to trust that God and, like, for example, in this parish, the priests, the parish council, that we're all going to be good stewards of what we get and use it responsibly and for the glory of God, which is what probably half of our parish council meetings are about, is how, what are we going to do this? We got to do this. We got to do that. We have to use it responsibly. And we do. We have these discussions. Is this a good, responsible way to use this money? And as any group of people, you're going to have various opinions. That's okay. That's healthy. Because in the end, we come to a consensus and decide this is the best way to do it. George can attest to that. So you got to learn. And that's hard, by the way, to just trust in God. Just trust. It's going to be used right. So if you go back through this, what did I just tell you? I told you to give first fruits, regular, freely, joyful, sacrifice, without expectations. Now we come to your question, the tithe. Anybody know what the word tithe means? What? 10. Right, 10%. Where does that come from? Guess where? The Bible. Right? Kind of that book we read, So it's biblical, and it's found not only in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament. And what does it mean it's technically 10%? Can we strive? We should all strive to be able to give 10%. When you think about it, it's not that much, but it could be. It could be. Every time I've seen people who strive for that, and they've obtained it, I can't quantify it. Others say, I see many blessings in return. Most importantly, that they're at peace with themselves. In other words, they've broken that chain that they have, which shackles them to money or whatever. They've learned to give freely and regularly and all that stuff. Now, can we all get to there? It's hard. It's hard. For many of us who are living on the edge, it's tough. I get that. My advice is pick a percent. 1%, 2%, 3%, 50%. I don't care. 100%. Pick a percent and do it. And not in isolation, right? If you're going to give a percent of this, of your time and your talent and your treasure. Just find out what it is. So it all has to do with, and if we follow those guidelines, you'll see. But remember, and this is important, we read this on Holy Monday, Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, those are spices, because the temple would take a percentage of those to help for the operation of the temple, but neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the other. So if you're going to give the tithe, this is Christ speaking, also remember that you're supposed to be merciful, loving, kind, forgiving, all the things that we're supposed to be doing. This is specifically for the leaders, but it equally applies for all of us. So when we think in terms of the tithe and taking that 10%, and again, it comes right from Leviticus and all that, where it goes through all these sort of regulations. It's something to think about. Percentage giving is a way in which we start to think about it in a concrete term. God bless the sweet people who, are elderly, and they've been given $1 in the collection plate for the last 30 years, because that's what they did when they were 30 years ago. $1 back then is different than $1 right now. God bless them, but have they really thought about it? Like what it is that they're doing there? And again, I get it. There's the widow's mite. That's all they have. And that makes it, when someone gives $1 and they're living on a fixed income, and I'm just picking, and they are living in poverty, that $1 has so much more meaning than the person who's very, very wealthy and gives $1, right? So you have to think in terms of, again, see how it comes back to the spiritual life, about how it's a spiritual act, how it's supposed to get there with God. So, first fruits, regularly, freely, joyfully, sacrificially, without expectation of receiving anything in turn, and pick a percentage and do it. I'm going to give you a few more quotes, so we'll finish up here. Paul continues, 2 Corinthians 8. And here's my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year, you were the first not only to give, but also to desire to do so. And then he goes, now finish the work. I love Paul. He's so good. So that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Paul gets it, right? How much more clear can you do it? If you're going to do it, and complete it. It doesn't matter how much it is. You give on what you have, not what you don't have. On Sunday of Orthodoxy, remember all the way back then? When we started that first Sunday? This is a verse we sing. This is about Lent, by the way, which, by the way, we've talked about this. Lent, you're supposed to, the money you save in eating simply and less, you're supposed to put aside and give to the poor. So, come, let us cleanse ourselves, this is a hymn that's sung, by almsgiving and by acts of mercy to the poor, not sounding a trumpet or making a show of our charity. Let not our left hand know what our right hand is doing. Let not vainglory scatter the fruit of our almsgiving, but in secret let us call on him who knows all secrets. Father, forgive us our trespasses, for you love mankind. That's how we enter Lent. Isn't that powerful? So, another quote. St. Isaac the Syrian, another early church saint. If you give something to one in need, let the cheerfulness of your face precede your gift, and comfort his sorrow with kind words. And when you do this by your gift, the gladness of his mind surpasses even the needs of his body. Sometimes, if you give joyfully and happily and say, here, help, I know you need help, here, that gives dignity to that person. Because it's not just about giving to that person. You've now fed your soul. You've given it. Last quote. This is from the Philokalia, that ancient set. Our Abba Dorotheus. No one can say, I am poor and hence I have no means of giving alms. For even if you cannot give as the rich give their gifts into the temple treasury, giving 2 farthings, interesting translation, as the poor widow did, and from you, God will consider it a greater gift than the gifts of the rich. And if you do not have as much as 2 farthings, you can take pity on the sick and give alms by ministering them. And if you cannot even do this, you can comfort your brother by your words. A good word is better than the best of gifts. How can you sum up stewardship better than that? Right? You give what you can. You do it with love and compassion and joy, thanking God that he gave you the opportunity to give. So that's my brief one. Look at our time. A little bit over. You guys make me over. Anyway, so questions. Anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions on this? Is it what you thought it was?
No.
No? What did you expect me to talk about?
I knew it was going to be different. I knew it wasn't just going to be like...
How much money to give the church?
Yeah.
So I can get paid?
I couldn't tell you what you were going to tell me, though. I just knew, it wasn't what I was expecting.
Anybody else? Anybody out in TV land? Guess not. Okay. Any comments? Yes, Darlene.
If everybody did that, there would be heaven on earth.
Yeah?
That would be it.
Yep. I'll just say this boldly, and this is not a knock on this parish at all. If everybody in this parish gave 1%, just 1% to this parish, we would have no problems with finances, with work that we do, all that sort of stuff. Just 1%.
And it's not that big of a church,
Yeah.
congregation-wise, you know?
I know parishes that have really taught, and it took them years and years, and they moved to this idea of tithing. And it was uncomfortable at first because it's easier to say, well, everybody give this much money, and then we know how much money we have coming in, and it's easy to pay the bills. I will say, without hesitation, standing here, every parish that moved to this idea of percentage giving, and though it was painful at first, they were here, they went like this, and then they went like that. And why do you think it is? Any guess? Had nothing to do with the amount of money.
Because they're finally understanding why.
Yeah, because it was a spiritual act, and God blessed it. And once you saw it in that terms, that this was just one discipline among many disciplines, took off. Took off because people were doing it as a spiritual act, not as a bill that has to be paid. Yeah.
It's interesting too because especially in America, we have like such a harsh criticism of churches generally, you know, and you always talk about
Money, government, peace.
You know,
I hear that all the time.
right? But it is interesting. I heard this guy. He was giving a lecture on. He does Old Testament lectures and stuff like that. He's Orthodox, Seraphim Hamilton, and he just said something small, but it stuck out to me that having money is not a bad thing.
It's what you do with it.
Yeah, it's hard. Like when he told the young man to sell all his belongings, that was that young man's calling. That was what he was supposed to do.
He had it wasn't about the money.
Right.
That was standing between him and God. And how do you know that? Because what did he do? He walked away sad.
Right.
Because he was wealthy. But all of us have something that stands between us and God. All of us. And we have to learn to overcome that in order to grow closer to God. That's the real, what that story is trying to...
Or like the rich man going through the eye of the needle.
The eye of the camel. Do you know what they mean by that? The camel, by the way? Here, little fun fact. You always say, how can you get through? A camel is another name when you do weaving, right? You have a particular piece of cloth. You've probably seen this on looms and stuff. It's called a camel. And you put the wool through that, and then you use that to weave, right? It's almost like a needle, you know, like when you put the thread in, and so you know you have these looms and they go like this and like this, right? The camel, you know, you would do your pattern, close it, and you do your pattern and close it, and that's how you got your cloth, right? So the camel was that piece, that piece of equipment that allowed you to weave. So that's what it means. Rich man to go. Then a camel passed through the eye of the needle. Yeah. That's what they're talking about.
So it's possible?
No, it's impossible.
It's impossible.
Because you got the needle, you got the camel. Because the needle threads the camel doesn't thread the needle.
And that's what he's talking. He's not talking about
an animal.
Very interesting.
Yes, like locusts, right? John the Baptist ate locusts. He's not talking about bugs.
My mom has told me that since I was little. That he was eating bugs.
No, he was eating locust plant, which has this fruit in the desert.
She must have
that you can eat that. Yeah.
They really run with that, though.
I know it's
really run with the whole bug thing.
Yeah, but remember, John the Baptist was an Essenes. They didn't eat meat. Period. So why would bugs? And plus, he's Jewish. That eating bugs is totally against. What do you call it?
Their thing.
Kosher.
Kosher. It's against their law.
Was it called kosher then?
No, dietary.
It was the Mosaic law.
What?
But I think they do without the consumption of some bugs based on certain criteria. Like I think grasshoppers are allowed or something.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I'm pretty sure there are some bugs that are
I'm not sure.
All right, let's ask Google.
No, don't. We're going down the rabbit hole. Anyway, that's it. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll pick this up next Thursday where we will talk about salvation. And again, it's not what you think. So, let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs, bestowing life. Amen. Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is
risen.